Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Anita Kellogg, and I'm here today with Robert Kelly, a professor in the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at the Pusan National University in South Korea. Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me today.
Hi, as I mentioned to you offline, I recently returned from South Korea, and the one thing that seemed to be on everyone's mind was the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. For context, on the evening of December 3rd, President Yoon declared martial law, accusing the opposition party, which has a majority in the National Assembly, of conducting anti-state activities and collaborating with North Korean communists to destroy the country, thereby creating a legislative dictatorship. The following day, both parties passed a motion to lift martial law. President Yoon did so a few hours later. President Yoon was impeached on December 14th, which was upheld by the Constitutional Court on April 4th. He is currently facing a criminal trial for leading an insurrection. What do you think led to Yoon's decision to declare martial law? Did he perceive that his own political survival was at stake?
Sure. I don't know if he did. I think that's kind of delusional. I don't really think there was anything remotely that extreme at stake. No, I think if you actually read the statement, I think it really reflects sort of two things. One, it reflects sort of long-standing South Korean conservative beliefs, McCarthyite-ish perhaps, in that the South Korean left is somehow in cahoots with North Korea. The right-left split in South Korea is still overlaid, if you will, by the Cold War of, that sort of continues on the peninsula. And so in the same way that sort of European conservative parties used to think that social democratic parties in Europe were somehow sort of cavorting with the Soviets and stuff like that, that dynamic still sort of exists here, right? I mean, it's a regular sort of attack by South Korean conservatives on the Progressive Party here that they're pro-North Korea and so on. And I think Yoon Suk-yeol drank deeply of that ideology. There's a lot of conspiracy theories on YouTube and on the South Korean right. YouTube is sort of like the South Korean conservatives' venue to spread conspiracy theories, not Twitter. And Yoon was referencing those things in the run up to the declaration and then afterwards. So I think that was one thing. And that's sort of old news, right? I mean, this has been a problem, I think, for electability of South Korean conservatives for a long time. They kind of struggle to deal with the fact that the South Korean Progressive Party is kind of a social democratic party, not a pro-North Korean communist revolutionary movement. And the other thing is, quite honestly, I think that Yoon Suk-yeol was very new to politics. He hadn't held elective office before, and he did not grasp that divided government, right, where the legislature is controlled by one party and the executive is controlled by another, is just typical democratic behavior. It's typical democratic outcome, right? It's a presidential system, right? We know from Linz and others, right, that presidential systems often return gridlock because you have the dual mandate problem. And that's what you had here. And I just don't think that Yoon grasped that. I think Yoon probably ran for office too early. He should have been a mayor or, an MP or something or other first. And then he would have realized that dividing government is just normal in presidential systems. He didn't grasp that, and I think he wildly overreacted to the bad behavior of the opposition in the legislature. To be fair to you, and I do think that the South Korean opposition did abuse legislative tools. I do think they were pointlessly, needlessly obstructionist of his government. I think they really personalized disputes with him. They went after his wife in a way that I think was really mean-spirited and inappropriate. But I think those grievances were legit. But I mean, Yoon just wildly overreacted. I really think it's that simple. I don't actually, and all this stuff about like a coup and the North Koreans are on the move. None of that.
Right.
That's YouTube conspiracy. None of that's real.
Martial law just seems such an extreme measure, right? Yeah. I remember being so shocked when I turned on the TV and saw this and just couldn't imagine a Democratic president actually feeling like that was a good idea.
Right.
Given that this is the second conservative president in a row to be impeached, President Park Geun-hye was impeached in December 2016.
Right.
So what do you think the legacy of conservatives in South Korean presidential politics are?
Yeah, I think the conservatives need to really go into the wilderness for a while and get their act together and figure out what they stand for besides opposition to North Korea, which I would argue is actually a good thing. I mean, I actually fully accept that North Korea is Orwellian tyranny, and I do think the South Korean left kind of is not fully honest about that fact, which is something the right does capitalize on. Uh, but I mean, the South Korean right needs some kind of platform, and I think they've been sort of flailing for a while on this.
Mhm.
Um, and then also, I think the more practical, like sort of street level politics sort of issue, I think for the South Korean right is candidate recruitment, right? I mean, at this point, you've got
Mhm.
two
Yeah.
conservative presidents in a row, you know, that have been impeached. You know, one went to prison, the other one might well go to prison, right? I mean, that's a problem, right? When South Korea, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a comparative politics guy, but the South Korean left wing party, it's called the Democratic Party. The South Korean left wing party is a pretty typical social democratic party with pretty good institutionalized structures. You know, it's had the same name for most of all of its existence, I believe. It's got a pretty good leadership sort of recruitment and turnover. It functions like a reasonably organized, disciplined political party along the lines you would see in Western Europe or something. You know, the comparative politics folks would recognize it. The South Korean right is a mess institutionally, and I don't know why. Actually, I don't know enough about South Korean internal right wing mechanics to know. I have some guesses, but the right wing party here changes its name every few years. Like literally, they change their name like every 5 or 6 years, right? And the internal leadership struggles are almost always are personalistic, right? And there's very rarely do you get like a clear programmatic statement from conservative leaders about what they want to do if they get elected. And I think all that really needs to change, and they need to do party building, for lack of a better word, and like I said, sort of improve recruitment and get away from these sort of neophytes. Because the last president, the one who was impeached, she was also a neophyte. She was the daughter of a previous South Korean dictator, and she
Right.
got elected because of name recognition, right? And she also really had kind of no idea what she was doing in the presidency, and she screwed it up. I don't know if she deserved to be impeached for her screw up. He certainly did. But
Right.
yeah, I would argue again that party building is probably what is most needed here, right? Sort of developing thick, cohesive structures that generate good candidates who are going to not flame out when they get in front of
Right.
the media. So yeah,
In the last few presidential elections or the outcome of those elections, you've had a liberal, conservative. They really seem to go back and forth that way. Do you think that's reflective of the deep polarization in Korean politics or something else?
yeah, I think there's a pretty strong consensus out there now that Korea is pretty polarized. Certainly, I hear that from the comparative politics and Koreanists in my department and the writing on it. I mean, and certainly I see that every day in my own students. I mean, there is pretty sharp polarization here. Elections in Korea are determined by a few swing voters. You know, it's nobody wins with like 8%, 10%. Nobody wins with double
Right.
digits. I mean, forget it, right? That's always really really tight. The election in 2022 for Yoon Suk-yeol, that election was determined by less than 1%. There was a left-wing factional candidate who threw the election actually to the right. It was a classic example of Duverger's law. Um, and that's really where Korea is. It's all like the U.S. actually, I suppose.
Hmm.
And nobody really wins big anymore. And that what that means is that you get sort of flip flopping as you move from sort of one to the next. As you sort of as the presidency switches from one partisan affiliation to the other, and that is most noticeable. That is most acute. That flip flopping is most acute in foreign policy, which is where the South Korean right
Right.
and left really split. And at home, again, I'm not a comparative son of my R guy, but my sense is
Right.
at home
Yeah.
that there is a pretty thick corporatist mercantilist consensus here, right? And South Korean
Right.
conservatives do not talk like the U.S. right back home. They're not obsessed with tax cuts, and they don't talk that way. There is some of the Christian nationalism stuff here. There is a sort of very
Right.
vocal evangelical Protestant movement here, and
Hmm.
they're small. They're only about 10% of the population, but they're very loud in Korean conservative politics. Very loud. But the real split, I would argue here is on foreign policy, where the South Korean left and right are like on different planets when it comes to North Korea, and I think you saw that to a certain extent in Yoon's statement, right, where he channeled that long-standing conservative anxiety that the South Korean left is some kind of Trojan horse or fifth column for the Korean Workers' Party.
Yeah. So, what do you think is the chances to have the next president be liberal? I know the current leader has his own legal challenges. Uh, so, yeah, what do you think? And if so, like, how would that shape the international context?
Sure. Well, after Park and Hay was removed, The election in 2017 returned a progressive candidate from the Democratic Party. Moon Jae-in, he won by 4 or 5%, I believe. It wasn't a blowout. Korea's polarized. To be honest, I actually thought, given that the previous conservative president had been impeached, I actually thought the left was going to win by a more substantial margin. The fact that the right managed to come within 5 points of the presidency, despite being disgraced just 2 months earlier, really sort of again illustrates the polarization. So I would imagine you'll see. My guess is, using the past as prologue, and my guess is that you'll see a repeat of that. If anything, probably a bit more so because the impeachment crimes were more egregious this time than they were last time.
Mm,
Yoon Suk-yeol really deserved it. I mean, you can't
right.
suspend constitutional, you can't suspend the Constitution because of divided government, right? I mean, come on, right? I mean, that's what I mean. If Yoon had just been in politics for like a little longer, you might have grasped that. And I kind of don't understand why the people around him didn't just tell him that. Like, this is normal, like opposition legislators do this stuff. They get angry and they throw fruit. I mean, it's just kind of how, whatever. Anyway, that's just what. Anyway, so but the previous removal was for something that is much more disputed, right? Did it actually rise to the level of impeachment or not? That's another debate. But anyway, the point is this was more egregious. And if the previous election went 4 or 5 points to the left, my guess is it'll probably be more so. All that is a long way to say that I do think the South Korean left will win. The guy who leads the South Korean left, his name is Lee Jae-myung. He's the one who lost back
Mhm.
2022 by less than 1%. He's the lead candidate now. He's got some legal troubles, but whatever. I don't know enough about Korean law to know if he'll survive that. It looks like he will, though. I mean, it's certainly where the newspapers are talking about it. And so my guess is he'll probably be the president, and that comes that's June 3rd. I don't believe there's a transition period after impeachment. He becomes president right away. So the international ramifications of that are quite substantial, I would argue, because the South Korean left takes a really divergent view from South Korea's allies on a host of issues. Okay, so South Korean conservatives get along well with Japan and the United States, and sort of broadly speaking, the
Mm,
Western rule-based order, liberal international order community, whatever. Okay, South Korean left does not. South Korean
right.
left doesn't want rapprochement with Japan, right? Anti-Japanism is a sort of a
Right.
core domestic political value for the left. The South Korean left is pretty nationalistic, arguably racist, and wants to reach out to North Korea on the basis of inter-Korean unity, and they're our brother and kin and whatever, and they're this sort of misguided Korean state, and we should sort of bring them back into the fold rather than isolate them and chase them around. And it's America that created this problem by bombing North Korea so hard back in 1951 and all this other stuff. Okay, we don't have time for all that. Um, and then when it comes to China, the South Korean left doesn't want to really be involved in a U.S. China conflict over Taiwan. In fact, Lee Jae-myung has said that openly, that South Korea should not participate, which, if it happens, could precipitate a massive crisis because the U.S. has air assets here that would almost certainly want to use, and then I don't know what would happen, right? I mean, would like Korean MPs to drive to U.S. air bases and say you can't launch your plane? I mean, that's just, I don't even want to know where that goes. And so, yeah, I think there's room for real division here, and that all assumes a traditional U.S. internationalist president,
Right.
right, along the lines of Joseph Biden, right? But with Donald Trump in there, I mean, I don't know what Donald Trump will do on Korea, right? I mean, last time he was horrible on Korea. I don't know what he'll do or say if he gets involved in this. I would imagine there's going to be a real personal clash between Trump and Lee Jae-myung. There was between Trump and Moon Jae-in. They loathed one another. The alliance was pretty rocky. Then it didn't implode though. Maybe in part because Trump was surrounded by the normal advisors, right? The adults in the room, as they say, right? Now he's not, so who
Mhm.
knows what he's going to do? When Trump was in there last time, he said if he got reelected, he was going to blow up the South Korean alliance. And now there's no one around him to restrain him. I don't think Rubio is going to, right? Rubio's stabbing Ukraine in the
Right.
back as we speak. So if Trump wants to just walk out the door, I mean, it might
Yeah.
happen. I don't know if Congress will fight him on that. Old Congress might have, but I don't know, MAGA, I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, so you're basically setting up, I think, a huge collision, right? On the one hand, you got sort of like this kind of like, I don't know, this unilateralist, belligerent, bullying, isolationist take, community running the United States now. And also you've got this sort of progressive, you know, presidency on the cusp here in South Korea. And South Korea and progressives have a long history of sort of agitation against the United States, reading the American position here as neo-colonial. wanting to reach out to North Korea to the point of jeopardizing the alliance, undermining the sanctions regime. A lot of what the South Korean left wants to do with North Korea, they're actually not allowed to do because the sanctions say they're illegal, and the South Korean left says we don't care about the sanctions, we're just going to do it anyway, which has created a lot of problems. On China, I think the South Korean left is just blind. I think they've just got their head in the sand. I don't know. It's just I'm really actually quite concerned that the alliance is going to have some kind of explosion right sometime in the next year. So
One country that you didn't mention is China, and I know that conservatives and liberals have different takes on China too. Uh, One thing I find interesting is that, in 2016, 2017, you have the THAAD missile crisis, where the US put missiles in South Korea. Then China complained that these missiles could look into their own space. And so they punished Korea by closing all kinds of latte stores, having
right,
protests,
right,
stopping
sure.
tourism, all those sort of things. Has that made Korea any more wary of China? No,
Korean public
just, oh,
Korean public opinion has swung pretty hard against China in the last few years. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I mean it's something like 70% of South Koreans don't approve of China. South Koreans, generally speaking, the public is pro alliance and pro America. They don't like Trump because they don't know what he represents, right? But this has always been a problem actually for the South Korean left to sort of return what we're talking about. The South Korean left, I think, would like to pursue a more pro detente. I don't want to say pro North Korean, but sort of North Korea friendly
mhm,
line. I think they'd like to draw greater distance from the U.S., right? But they can't because they're constrained by public opinion, which is really pro-alliance. I think the public grasps what a lot of the South Korean left doesn't want to admit, which is that the U.S. position here backstops a lot. It backstops Korea's participation in the world economy. It backstops Korea's access to Wall Street. It backstops South Korea's exports. It backstops IFDI, right? It keeps South Korea's defense costs much, much lower than they would be. I mean, if we leave, South Korea's defense costs like triple. They probably have to conscribe women. And I think the South Korean left just doesn't want to admit a lot of this. They just dance around it, which is really, really unhelpful, by the way. And so on China, the South Korean left is sort of again in this space, I would argue, where they're kind of not quite grasping the autocratic turn, I suppose, the expansionist turn, I suppose, of Chinese policy under Xi Jinping, right? And they really want to sort of read South Korea as this kind of like neutral player, right? A previous South Korean progressive president referred to South Korea as a hinge or like a pivot state between the two, right? Rather than being allied with the United States, South Korea would be like this hinge between the U.S. and China, and that is, I would argue, that's kind of fanciful, right? I mean, there's U.S. bases all over this
mhm.
country. Pretty obvious, it's a treaty ally, right? It's right there in print. Um, but the South Korean left doesn't want to get chain ganged into a Sino-U.S. conflict over Taiwan, right? And
Right.
but I mean, Secretary of Defense Hegseth was in the region last week just saying, or 2 weeks ago, just saying, China's now the most important thing. It's more important than Ukraine. It's more important than the war on
Mhm.
terrorism. It's more important than, Hamas, all these, the Middle East. China is our big thing. And if that's true, then, we're looking at a pretty major collision with the South Koreans on this if Lee Jae-myung becomes president. Unless, I mean, I don't know, maybe he'll back off, right? He might be constrained by South Korean public opinion, which, as I said, is really, not not aggressively anti-Chinese, but distant, right? And is still pretty pro-American. I think the Chinese dance around the fact that that was really obviously designed for stopping North Korean missiles, right? That's not really actually
Right.
designed to shoot down
Right.
Chinese outbounds, which would already be in the stratosphere. Forget all that, right? That doesn't reach high enough to actually hit the Chinese outbounds headed towards Con US, which is what they said. So they were just lying, and they knew that too. And then the South Korean left also kind of danced around it with making up all these sort of fake, ridiculous claims that THAAD like emitted radiation, and like if you like live near where the battery was, you were gonna get like thyroid cancer. I mean, it was just all this stuff. It was just all such bunk. I don't know. I don't know.
It's interesting how the Korean left certainly played into that. And then, one of the fascinating, debates in certainly in the IR literature that I've looked at was did South Korea capitulate or not? Because you have the president following Park Chung-hee saying the famous three no's, no more, we're not going to have any more THAAD missiles.
Right.
We're not going to be part of a Chinese, we're not going to be part of a Japanese
Right.
U.S. missile agreement, defense agreement. But when President Yoon Suk-yeol took office, he said those three no's are not actually foreign policy. So how do you think that affects the overall strategic context?
So I think the Chinese sort of led South Korea where the South Korean left wanted to go anyway. Right? South Korean left doesn't want trilateralism with Japan. It doesn't because they don't want any kind of a thick security relationship with Japan, really at all. Right? Even basic intelligence sharing with Japan, the general security of information and general security of military information administration. I can't. GSOMIA, GSOMI. I can't remember the full acronym for. Anyway, it's intelligence sharing with Japan. South Korean left even rejected that, which is pretty light, basic stuff. It's basically Japan giving South Korea sort of satellite photography, and South Koreans giving them like data from defectors. It's pretty basic stuff. And South Korea actually benefits more from it than Japan does. They should have taken it, whatever. The South Korean left fought it tooth and nail and only did it because we, the Americans, kind of arm twisted them behind the scenes. And so when it comes to when it comes to Japan, I mean, they just don't want to do it. So when the Chinese said you can't have trilateral missile defense with Japan, South Korean left's like, we want that anyway. And the same thing on missile defense, right? The South Korean left doesn't believe in missile defense against North Korea because they don't think that North Korea is going to use nuclear weapons against South Korea, which is another thing where I'm just like, oh my God, are you kidding me? But they'll tell me that, right? That the nuclear weapons are aimed at the Americans, not us. We're brother Koreans. They would never use them against us. I'm just kind of shocked when I hear people tell me that. But the argument was that provoked North Korea into building more missiles, which might be true, right? I mean, you can overwhelm that if you just keep shooting and shooting and
Uh-huh.
shooting, right? I mean, you can just
Uh-huh.
overwhelm that with inbounds. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, North Korea. If we have a war in North Korea, they've got to launch because it's going to be the use it or lose it dilemma is going to be really severe. And the South North Korea is so conventionally outclassed that they almost certainly have to use missiles to fight back. So if you don't install missile defense here, you're basically saying South Korean cities are defenseless. I mean, I don't know. The South Korean left strikes me as it's taking an enormous gamble by leaving South Korean cities defenseless, right? Which is something, and we've been telling them for a long time. And at minimum, I think U.S. forces here want to have coverage, and so that's the way we pitched that. It was actually meant to cover U.S. forces, but whatever. I mean, these are all the interesting dilemmas, by the way, that are going to sort of start to crop up if Lee Jae-myung becomes president, right? Because the South Korean left has really, really dissonant foreign policy beliefs on all of these questions from what we, the U.S., traditionally think, right? That's why traditionally the U.S., and we're not supposed to say this, right? No U.S. official would say this, but traditionally we like it when there's a South Korean conservative president because the South Korean right lines up nicely with Japan and the U.S. foreign policy
Right.
community. All of us are sort of center right, hawkish on North Korea and China and Russia, and the South Korean left is just sort of off doing its own thing, which is, fine, whatever. They're a democracy, they can do it. But I think the South Korean left often ducks the strategic reality here, right? Which is that Xi Jinping is not his forebears, and the North Koreans are building all these missiles, and they got a lot of nuclear weapons, and North Korea is probably going to have to use nuclear weapons if a war happens because they're so conventionally outclassed. I mean, South Korean left is not thinking through all this, I think, deeply enough, right? I get it that they think the right was too hawkish, but I don't know. I mean, I think what the South Korean left really wants is strategic neutrality, right? And if they do that, they're
Uh-huh.
going to build nuclear weapons, and they might have to conscribe women. And I just wish they would make that pitch directly to the public, right? Is that like we
Uh,
can do anything the Americans, we can go our own way, but you got to also tell the public that defense costs are going to double or triple. We're going to have to build our own satellite network. We're going to have to build our own missiles. We're going to have to build our own nuclear weapons. We're probably going to have to build an aircraft carrier. I mean, you're talking the spiraling defense costs, right? And I don't know. I mean, all these debates are going to like explode in the next couple of years, and Trump, right, with his sort of like erratic, unpredictable behavior, is just going to like pour fuel on the fire, right? I mean, I don't know. It's going to be pretty wild, right? You and Biden, it was like nice.
right.
Everybody
And then,
agreed. We all knew what's going on. Right? Now I don't know what's going to happen. Don't ask me. I don't know what the next 6 months is going to be like. I don't know.
yeah, well, I think with Trump, nobody knows.
Right.
Um, so, I mean, you just bring up so many interesting tensions. So, I mean, one thing that Biden accomplished, and probably because of you alluded to a conservative president, is some historical agreement between Korea and Japan. Do you think that agreement will be broken under a more liberal president? And how will the tensions with Japan affect like the regional security?
So the South Korean left will almost certainly go back to the traditional issues, particularly South Korean leftist president, particularly if he gets in trouble. We'll go back to traditional issues of sort of banging away at Japan, right? Japan is kind of like a useful totem particularly when South Korean leftist politicians get in trouble, they have a scandal, you can always sort of like go to Docto or something like that and talk about Japanese textbooks. And it would certainly help if the Japanese would come around on this and come clean, right? I mean, one of the
Right.
reasons why we have all those problems because the Japanese are constantly dancing around the reality of what happened and they don't want to admit it. And oh my God, I've been to so many conferences on this. I mean, I get it. And it would be nice if the Japanese would just sort of do what the Germans did and just be like, we did all this terrible stuff, and here it all is, and whatever, right? But there's a limit, and I argue this to South Koreans all the time too, right? That Japan is a constitutional democracy, which means even if the government says we apologize and we shouldn't do all these things and it was wrong or whatever, you can't keep South Korea or Japanese conservatives from saying to the public, Japanese colonialism was good for Korea, and Japanese conservatives say that kind of stuff, right? What are you going to, you can't put them in jail, right? It's a liberal democracy. So there's like a hard limit, right? Japanese liberalism, constitutional liberalism imposes a hard limit for how much the Japanese can do. Right. And so unless the South Korean left accepts that, the issues will never really go away. And that's really what this has turned into, right? This is a big contest between the South Korean left and the Japanese right. And if the benchmark is for the two of them to agree on what happened in the first half of the 20th century, this thing will never be solved. It just won't, because those two communities are just too far apart. Right. And that's what I'm worried about, right? That the Japanese left, the South Korean left to come in and sort of start talking about this kind of stuff. Japanese conservatives will go on TV and we'll get another big fight about Docto or the comfort women or something like that. Trilateralism will explode, and Donald Trump will just sort of step back and be like, I don't care anyway. Good luck. You guys go deal with China on your own because the Chinese are buying my meme coin and they're bribing me. you know, I mean, I don't know. Is Trump going to fight for Taiwan? I don't know. Probably not. Would Trump fight for South Korea against North Korea, a nuclear weapon state? Probably not. Would Trump use nuclear weapons to defend South Korea? Almost certainly not. Right. I mean, we haven't even gotten to that point, but that's just going to like layer on even more uncertainty now, right? Because America's commitments out here aren't credible anymore. Not just in Northeast Asia, the Philippines, Australia.
Hard to talk about South Korea without mentioning the tariffs that Trump wants to place on Korea that are now paused. I heard this morning that there is a sense that maybe they're going to announce a trade deal next week. What sort of concessions do you think Korea might be making or be willing to make in that?
Yeah, so actually, I was just reading about that on the newspaper just before we got on, right? It looks like they're calling it like the July package. I'm not quite even sure what that means. It's all still unclear. I believe Korean negotiators are in Washington, D.C. right now, like as we're speaking. Um, so it looks like the Americans are talking about the fluctuation of the won as an NTB. I don't know about that. I don't know if that counts as an NTB. I know the Korean won has depreciated pretty sharply, which makes South Korea's
Hmm.
exports cheaper, but that isn't because of BOK, Bank of Korea, the Reserve Bank. That's not because of BOK manipulation, although the BOK has manipulated the exchange rate in the past. It's not because of that. It's because of the constitutional crisis, right? Suddenly people freaked out
Right.
and started pulling their money out. Um, I don't know if the Trump people get that, right? I mean, or if they care, right? I mean, basic competence is a big problem for the Trump administration. I don't think they fully quite understand this, right? I mean, they're also surprised that U.S. Treasuries spiked last week after the tariff war.
Hmm.
Okay, whatever. So I don't know if they fully get it. But I mean, if their argument is that BOK shouldn't intervene, okay, you can do that. I don't know how they're going to do it. I don't know how they're going to get monitoring on BOK purchases, but that's one thing we have complained about in the past. The U.S. Treasury used to keep a list. I don't know if they still do it of currency of countries who they think manipulate the currency, and South Korea has been on that list a lot in the past. Um, the BOK here calls it smoothing. The idea is
Hmm.
to prevent these wild fluctuations of the South Korean won. The argument here, I've been on a million panels on this too. The rocks call it smoothing to facilitate export, right? Which is one of the problems here. Actually gets to sort of a
Right.
structural problem in the South Korean economy, which is there's not enough domestic consumption, right? And I can talk about that if you want. And so they're really, really export dependent, which means that the won's, exchange rate is exorbitant or uh, inordinately important in South Korean politics, hence the BOK is always tweaking and getting in trouble with the IMF and the Americans and whatever. So I bet that's one thing. Um, I don't know. Korean tariffs are pretty low because the U.S. and Korea have been in a free trade deal since 2009 called KORUS, Korea-U.S. FTA. I don't know how much lower you can beat those tariffs down, right? Korean agriculture is traditionally protected. The rice sector here is really, really vulnerable to foreign competition, but not from American rice. I'm not even sure we grow rice in the U.S. It's really rice from Asia,
Yes.
from China. We do?
We
We don't.
do.
We do.
I'm from Arkansas. Arkansas is the big exporter of rice. Interesting.
Oh, okay. South Korean agriculture is pretty
But
vulnerable. Because I mean, it's I can look out my window and see hills. It's hilly here. Farms are very small. They use a lot of technology. I mean, it's so like if you had full free trade in food and ag here, the Korean farming industry would get wiped out, which is politically really, really sensitive. Farmers are always, I mean, you know this, right? Farmers are punched way above their weight in domestic qualities around the world. And so that might be something the one thing I actually hope the Americans actually push Korea on is oligopolization and cartelization. I would argue that's really the problem here, right? I mean, I don't know if we have time for this too, but Korea's got like, a couple dozen mega corporations. The Korean word is chaebol, right? They're basically these multi-sectoral, oligopolistic octopuses, which just kind of like have their tentacles in everything here, right? And dramatically reduce competition, right? The distribution system here is also really tricky for things like alcohol and stuff like that, right? You've got sort of a few cartels that control it and stuff. Foreign, like I know this, I've done this as a case study with my students. Foreign alcohol has had a lot of trouble penetrating South Korea because they have to find sort of local distributors, whatever. It's big. That is what I would really like to see the U.S. go after. But that gets deep into sort of harmonization issues and stuff like that, and political economy structure. Then you start getting really close to Korean politics because they're close to the wealthy families. It's tricky. So I would imagine you won't get too much of that, which is a shame actually, because Korean consumer prices are much too high, right? And a lot of it is because of these oligopolies, not monopolies, but you have too many oligopolies. And to be fair to the Koreans, the Korean Free Trade Commission, the FTC, I think they call it, has actually identified this again and again and again and again. And Korean politicians just won't act against the biggest corporations because they're worried about the backlash and the funding.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that really shocked me, and the people that I was mostly talking to were more conservative in the defense industry, but I had more than one person say that they felt like South Korea was not paying its share for defense, and that was
Really?
unfair to the United. Yeah, it was. I couldn't believe
Oh,
it, but more than like at least two or three people said that to me. I
damn.
don't know if that's reflective of any opinion in Korea, but certainly in the defense space, it seems pretty strong. So, do you think South Korea is preparing for Trump to negotiate reduced American presence on the
Well,
peninsula?
so from what I've read, the Special Measures Agreement, the SMA is not up for reevaluation as a part of this current trade deal, which I imagine is a huge relief to the South Koreans because last time Trump was in there, he wanted like a five-fold increase, and the
Hmm.
Rocks were like, ah, right, and basically just waited him out until Biden became president, and then Biden came back and asked for a little bit more and whatever. Basically, every time they have these things, every 4 or 5 years or so, the Rocks kick in a little bit more. It goes up, I think, like a few percentage points every couple of years. Um, South Korean defense spending is 2.7% of GDP, which compared to other U.S. allies is, downright, contributory, right? I mean, the whole free riding debate that we hear about
Hmm.
Japan and Italy and stuff like that, that
Hmm.
doesn't really exist here. But I mean, on the other hand, and this is what I argue when I teach my students in my strategy courses, right? I mean, the 2% benchmark is just, I don't know where this came from. We all use it, right? I mean, things like fall out of the sky. It's not, it's just a number, right? And what really matters, of course, is South Korea's strategic environment, right? If South Korea is in a tough neighborhood, maybe they should spend more, and they are, right? I mean, South Korea is surrounded by three nuclear autocracies, and so I would argue, yeah, that South Korea's defense budget should be higher. I've written in print. I said in Foreign Affairs 2 months ago, South Korea should have nuclear weapons. I think that's accurate. I think South Korea should probably start building a bigger navy because South Korean S-locks run through the South China Sea, which the Chinese are going to take over, and they're probably going to embargo oil at some point, right? They'll embargo fuel shipments from the Persian Gulf to the East Asia's democracies, to Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. That's the big benefit of controlling the South China Sea, right? They can block that. They can block those oil shipments. And so South Korea and Japan both need to develop a larger navy, I would argue, because I don't know if we're going to do that. I don't know. Is Trump going to do FONOPs in the South China Sea anymore? I don't think so. He's not going to take any big risks, right? Um, so I don't know. I don't know if the money is the problem. The user argument is the South Koreans overspend on expensive, flashy kit. So they buy F-35s, but then they don't spend on vanilla stuff like the spare parts to actually keep the F-35s in the air.
Hmm.
They don't spend on like comfortable socks and body armor and boots and stuff for recruits. Instead, they spend on, flashy stuff like, THAAD or aircraft carriers or something like that. That's a very common critique, particularly from U.S. analysts here, that the rocks don't do enough on logistics and supply chain stuff, and it's kind of like these end platforms that are really expensive and hard to sustain, require a lot of American support, which we end up carrying without charging them and whatever. Um, but I would imagine that rock defense spending will go up in the next few years, in part because of the uncertainty of Trump. I mean, I don't believe that Donald Trump would fight for South Korea. I don't believe that the U.S. commitment to South Korea is credible under him, and I would imagine that many people in the South Korean defense community think that too, which might be what they're suggesting, right? Which is that maybe we can get the Americans to be a more credible partner if we jack up defense spending. That might work. That might placate Trump. But I mean, the Europeans got to started saying they were going to hit 2%, and then didn't Trump say like a month ago he wants them to get to 5% of
Hmm.
5%?
Yeah,
The
we don't
Europeans,
even have 5%, I think.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That'll be like 2050 when they get the five. And the rock spending five. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I just don't believe that Trump will fight for them. So maybe they will get defense spending up just because they feel like they have to go and be more independent. I mean, that would certainly be my advice. I mean, if I was advising the next pot truck, I would say, yeah, Trump's an unreliable partner, and you should start thinking about doing it yourself.
One of the interesting arguments you make is that South Korea should make its own nuclear weapons.
Right?
And I asked everybody I could possibly talk
Uh oh.
to what
Uh oh.
what they thought about that.
God,
And and
I'm
one
wrong.
of one of the no, I was just surprised how skeptical they were that South Korea would ever build its own nuclear weapons. And they were like, this won't even be a discussion under the new president. And then I have a friend who's a non-proliferation scholar, and he finds the idea very problematic. But you have this argument, and so I'm really curious why you think that South Korea should build its own nuclear weapons, and how would that affect regional security and
Okay.
stability?
But the short version is that as de Gaulle sort of pointed out 50, 60 years ago, extended deterrence requires the United States to risk its own cities to fight
Hmm.
for foreigners. I find that inherently hard to believe. I think that de Gaulle nailed it when he said to Kennedy, would you be willing to exchange New York for Paris? And Kennedy ducked the question, right? And that's a famous exchange from, I think, 1961. It's in Fruce and you can find it. And I've linked it in a couple of articles I've written and stuff. That's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, is Trump, right? And not just Trump, but the sort of very weird isolationist turn, unilateralist, isolationist, belligerent turn of the Republican Party, right? I mean, the
Hmm.
U.S. extended deterrence to South Korea expects a traditional liberal internationalist foreign policy community in the United States, and a president who broadly reflects the values of the foreign policy community, whatever, for the liberal international order, whatever. And that's just that the Democratic Party is there, the Republican Party used to be, but isn't, right? And so, it's just not. It's just I just don't think that whenever the Republicans are in the presidency now, that the U.S. nuclear commitment is credible to U.S. allies. Maybe to Israel because of the particular theological significance of Israel to the conservative bloc inside the Republican coalition. But I don't believe that the United States would actually risk serious nuclear escalation for any other ally, as long as MAGA runs the Republican Party. And so basically what that means is that every time the Republicans control the White House, the U.S. nuclear commitment to South Korean security is questionable. And South Korea faces three nuclear autocracies on its doorstep, and so it should establish mutually assured destruction on its own. Now, if you want me to get into the proliferation arguments, I actually go through these, and in the article, I have another article that just came out where I go into them in greater detail. I can give you that too. But the whole idea, the brief version of this, is that if the non-proliferation treaty is so fragile that one middle-income country building a few nuclear weapons while legally withdrawing from the NPT per Article 10, I think, which allows you to withdraw legally, right? For very good security reasons, right? It's pretty clear that South Korea is not building these things for prestige because they want to attack somebody. South Korea has been a good nuclear citizen for 30 years. They've been trying to get North Korea to not build nuclear weapons. The North Koreans have lied and cheated and scammed, and they've just been horrible counterparties on this issue. And South Korea has held its fire for all these years. If, despite all of that, the NPT were just unravel because of South Korea's exit, then the NPT wasn't really that restrictive and valuable anyway, right? I mean, the NPT can't be this super important regime that's sort of like holding back the flood of nuclearization, right? Of cascading nuclearization. It can't be that and all that robust and important, but also so fragile that one mid-sized power building a few nuclear weapons for reasons that are very obvious to everyone, right, suddenly would cause it to fall apart. I just that those two positions are intellectually incompatible.
So we'll definitely link to your article. The counter argument to what you're saying is that this would provoke China, and then you'd have Japan building its own nuclear weapons, China building its own nuclear weapons,
I
kind
can
of
address that if you like.
cascading from that. So how do you feel about
Sure.
that?
Right. So there's a couple things with the there are a couple general problems with the cascade argument. First of all, the basic logic of the cascade argument is undercut by the fact that nuclear weapons have been around for 80 years and there's only 9 nuclear weapon states, and we did have a nuclear weapon state which actually rolled back. Cascade logic sort of should mean reactive nuclearization just keeps going and going and going and going, right? And it hasn't. It hasn't. There have been some reactive nuclearizations, right? Soviet Union reacted to the U.S. and built, right? Pakistan reacted to India and built, right? But the logic of sort of like the kind of domino theory logic of cascading doesn't really have a logical endpoint, right? I mean, it should just keep going and going and going, right? Right? I mean, if China built nuclear weapons, back in the 70s, right, under Mao, right, then why didn't Japan build nuclear weapons back then? Okay. All right, so that's the first problem. I would argue that generally there are other things going on in why states choose to build nuclear weapons besides cascade effects, presumably generating so much anxiety that everybody feels they have to nuke up immediately, because the empirics of nuclear history don't actually support that assertion. Specifically when it comes to the region, right? First of all, when it comes to the local autocracies, Russia, Japan, China, Russia, North Korea, and China, they've already cascaded, right? So it's a moot point, right? I mean, South Korea is responding to pressure. It's not actually the one initiating the cascade, right? It's responding. And to South Korea's credit, it's held its fire, right? North Korea declared that it would not build nuclear weapons for the first time, that South Korea would be that the Korean Peninsula would be nuclear free. The North Koreans said this for the first time back in 1991. I mean, the North Koreans have been lying to us for 35 years. So, I mean, there's a reason why the South Koreans are doing this, and it's because the North Koreans have been negotiating with us in relentlessly bad faith, which the non-proliferation community just skates right by. I mean, they just don't address this point. I brought this up repeatedly at conferences. Anyway, okay, so the autocracies already have nuclear weapons, and then so the only other reasonable candidates, I suppose, regionally are Japan and Taiwan. Right now, Taiwan has pretty good reasons not to nuclearize, right? It's not clear why Taiwan would feel it needs to nuclearize in response to South Korea, right? South Korea's not going to invade Taiwan or nuke it or something like that, right? And when it comes to Japan, the most obvious answer for Japan, I think, and again, I think a lot of people who know Japan should be saying this, but aren't, which is that if Japan didn't build nuclear weapons in response to Chinese nuclearization and North Korean nuclearization, why would they build them in response to South Korean nuclearization? Right? If nuclear weapons in the hands of Koreans are so dangerous, liberal democratic Koreans, why didn't they respond to the development of nuclear weapons by Stalinist Koreans back in 2006, much less Maoist Chinese back in the 70s? Right? I mean, it's possible, but really, really unlikely, right? I mean, if you actually sort of like study the literature on why states develop nuclear weapons, right, it's not because of sort of this cascading anxiety, right? They do it for all sorts of other reasons. They're national security reasons. They sort of worry about sometimes they don't do it for political economy reasons because nuclearization signals a kind of aggressiveness that other liberal trading states worry about and stuff like that. I mean, the literature on this doesn't actually support the contention that cascading is the dominant driver. So I don't buy that. I mean, I don't know. I'm happy to get into it more, but I just don't. Like the Japanese government isn't like a robot, right? It's like they're not going to just do. Oh, the South Koreans did it. So I mean, it doesn't, right? Like wealthy modern states with deep bureaucracies and lots of experts who can sort of work out complicated responses to complicated issues don't just act that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not like on like like autopilot or something like that. So I don't buy that either. And who else is going to build nukes because South Korea did? Like Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam. I mean, come on. So I think all those objections fall apart pretty rapidly. And my co-author and I actually trot through these in some detail. We do a kind of pre-buttal thing in the foreign affairs piece.
Yeah, well, that's very fascinating. And this has been such a great conversation. I want to be respectful of your time, but this has
Oh,
been absolutely great. And I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing all these insights.
I'm happy to be on. Thanks.